Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. And this week in Module 4, we're going to take a look at Plato and his idealist thought. Now, most people, when they think of philosophy, think of Plato. And we already know that many things that occurred beforehand that set the stage for Plato to devise the ideas that he had. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at his ideas, in particular idealism, an early version of it, but as it is understood and filtered through his political philosophy. So the books we're going to look at deal with social and economic and political formations in order for us to understand exactly what we are talking about when we talk about idealism. So like the other slides, what I've done is I've kind of broken this thing down into separate sections. And the first one, I like to call the top 10 list. Okay, why was Plato so well known? Well, we're going to look at 10 specific things. Now, we're going to kind of brush over them, but it's good to know just exactly why Plato is a kind of go-to person when people start to think about and learn about philosophy. So, top 10 list. And then after that, we're going to look at four different books, the Phaedrus, the Republic, Statesman, and Laws. And they are also in chronological order. Laws is, I think, one of the very last books that Plato writes. He was lucky enough to live to the ripe old age of the mid-80s, 82, 84. So he wrote all that time. And then we're going to kind of wrap it up with a summary of what his political philosophy was all about as it is filtered through this notion of idealism. Okay, so the first five here for Plato's top 10 is he is considered to be the founder of idealist philosophy. So he is a rationalist. We talked last week about materialism and empiricism as one form of conducting or performing philosophy. The other one is using rationalism or idealism. And Plato is the one that really sets the stage for idealist philosophy, which really kind of takes the upper hand for a very, very long time. Basically the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, medieval theology, Roman philosophy, many of these different philosophies really owe their existence to Plato and his idealist philosophy. And it continues right until the very tail end of the 1800s, when Nietzsche is finally the one that destroys it altogether. So that's the first part. Plato is known as the father or founder of idealist philosophy. The second one is tied into this notion is that he also lays the foundation to Western spirituality. And he does that by creating this in a sense, perfect world where perfect forms exist. Truth, justice, beauty. All these notions of purity and perfection exist somewhere else. And that somewhere else is something that Christianity borrowed as a kind of metaphor for setting up the notion of heaven, where heaven is perfection. That idea comes from Plato, comes partly from his idealist thinking, but partly from the way in which he situates that perfect world as beyond the world of reality, the world of empirical senses. So something lies behind and beyond the world that we know today. That is essentially the way that Christians see the world as well. The notion that there is a sense of perfection behind it and beyond it, in the way in which God has created this perfect world. There's a spiritual dimension to reality as we know it. All of these ideas all come from Plato. Now, one of the ideas that Plato presents in his work and goes on for a very long time in a variety of different forms is this idea of dialectical thinking. Now, at this very early point, when we talk about dialectics, which is always a forward movement towards some particular goal. So in this particular example here, Plato has come up with a dialectical form that he calls basically truth by consensus. And what he means by that is in his dialogues, where we have several people discussing truth, beauty, justice, politics, economics, whatever it may be, whatever the topic is, there is always a discussion. And within the discussion, there is dissent, disagreement. There are squabbles back and forth. But of course, Plato being the final author of these dialogues, he is able to organize and construct the argument in such a way that over time we see individuals discussing and coming to an agreement about something. So it is truth through consensus. Eventually, the contradictions or inner turmoil or whatever it may be that they are trying to hammer out through an argument, eventually there is agreement by all those individuals who are part of that dialogue. So Plato, and as I mentioned last week and the week before, not a huge fan of the written word, but he did get around it by writing his stories or his parables, or at least his philosophy, in the form of a dialogue. That dialogue was dialectical because it was always a movement towards something, and that something was movement towards some kind of truth. Now, he was really good at it because here's a copy of my Plato book. It's 1,800 pages long. Not bad for a guy who had nothing to say. So the dialectical form of philosophy is this truth through consensus. So every character is allowed to speak their mind, which is what a dialogue would be. But remember, Plato is the one who has the final say. So he constructs that dialectical movement in such a way that it does achieve something. There is some degree of truth in his dialogues. So that's the third thing. The fourth is that he was able to invent a kind of philosophy that is critical, rigorous, systematic, and of course, all of this is done through that dialogical form, the dialectical form of agreement, disagreement, what ifs, what about that, and what do you mean by this? All of these aspects of a conversation are still critical and rigorous and systematic, but they look at serious issues of the day, ethical issues, political issues, metaphysical issues as well. Because at this point now, as I mentioned last week, with the ability of individuals to create their own laws and create their own life, you want to make sure you're doing it correctly. Because although the mythological stories may have been dispensed with, the mythological gods and goddesses are still around. And there's still that belief that you could be ensnared by the moray. You could be tricked by Zeus or by Hera. And if that happens, there could be hell to pay. So if you are going to behave in a certain way, you want to make absolutely sure that the movement you are about to engage in, or the ideas you're about to consider, are the right ones. So you critically and rigorously look at them, examine them from every possible perspective, and then decide on a movement forward. And so Plato was able to construct a kind of philosophy that is critical and rigorous and systematic in order to avoid these kinds of pitfalls. So he doesn't get rid of the gods and goddesses, but what he does, he provides an alternative where individuals can use these philosophical tools to decide what is the best course of action. Number 5, and this has a lot to do with Plato's philosophical demeanor. He belonged to an aristocratic family. He was a slave owner. And as a result, because of his wealth and influence and his aristocratic position, he hated the demos, right? The common people. Never really thought much of them, never thought that they could amount to a whole lot. Plato had this strange idea that all knowledge was always already there, and we could intuit that knowledge without even having to experience it. These would be notions about the world that were just waiting to be discovered. So it isn't really a kind of knowledge that allows us to move forward. Plato's idea of knowledge is one where we're looking backwards and looking within. And he also believed that only certain people could do that. You needed education. You needed that critical and rigorous and systematic examination of oneself, one's life, one's social and political position. And apparently the demos were incapable of doing this. And that's just the way he saw the world. So number 6, he was influenced, and this is in terms of his own philosophy, he was influenced by Socratic argument, the proverbial what if, followed of course by, so if you're saying this, then if I'm getting this right, you're saying the following. And Socrates was famous for using a kind of sort of critical tool where he would repeat back to the person he was having an argument with. And I remember, an argument is not a shouting match. It's a discussion, right? A rigorous discussion about a particular subject matter. what Socrates would do is he would repeat back to the person he's speaking to what they had just said. And then, of course, he would ask them to define their terms and realize very quickly that individuals often did not really know what they were talking about. They did not really understand fully the meaning of a certain term or the relationship that one term had with another term, and whether they really truly understood what justice was, what truth and beauty was. So Plato was very, very much influenced by this kind of thinking and incorporated it into his own philosophy. Now, the other thing which made him rather dangerous, and we'll see when we talk about his political ideas, is that he was fascinated with Pythagoras, right? And the Pythagorean mystical approach, the notion that the world is made up of numbers. Plato was fascinated by geometry, fascinated by mathematics, and believed that the world could be organized along these kind of mathematical lines. And as you can imagine, just try to build a society using mathematics. We can only have X number of people doing this and X number of people doing that. Right. But if you spend a week in a city or a village, people come and go, people bring in friends, somebody else moves in, somebody else moves out, people are born, people die. A society is a living, breathing entity that is constantly changing. And here's Plato trying to apply algebra and mathematics to this living entity. He wants to stop it from living. He wants to stop it from growing, and says, this is how a society can be perfect. Yeah, it could be perfect for maybe one afternoon, and the next day something else would occur. Think of the world that we've inhabited in the last, say, 2.5 years. How absolutely upended we have been from what we would typically do. Could you imagine Plato trying to deal with that? He'd lose his mind, because we have not been able to figure out anything using mathematics or numbers of any sort. Think of the idea of time. Time is just completely elastic. An entire day feels like 3 weeks, and then a week feels like a few hours. So the notion of trying to apply mysticism or mathematics to social formations became, in fact, quite dangerous. And Plato kept on for most of his life till finally the very tail end, when he started writing about laws and really created a kind of code book. And only then did he give up this idea of society being a kind of algebraic formula. It isn't. It never can be. Number 7, knowledge is a matter of recollection or divine insight, not empirical learning or observation or study. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the notion of knowledge is something that we seek within. We apparently have this information always already within us, and it's a matter of us, through divine insight, to learn it. So, is this interesting? Absolutely. Is it dangerous? Yes, it is. Why? Because many of these ideas are not rooted in any kind of reality whatsoever. Imagine if you are learning and trying to acquire wisdom, and everything you are learning has already always been there. How do you move forward? How do you then apply something that you've learned strictly through intuition, and then go, well, how does it have a bearing on the real world? How can I find an example in the real world of something like truth or beauty or justice, which are sort of usually capital letter words, capital T, truth, and so on. So yes, knowledge may be a matter of recollection and divine insight. That could be true. But the danger in that is that these are intuitions that don't need to be grounded in reality to be believed in and to be believed to exist. So this is something about Platonic idealism that can at times be quite dangerous, because that divine insight looks inward rather than looking outwards into the world in order to understand the world first and then come to some sort of reasonable explanation of it. And this is a really significant difference between Plato's way of thinking and Aristotle. Aristotle looks out into the world. Plato is only concerned with looking within, and that can really have its drawbacks. Now, going to number 8, that should make sense. He denied the reality of the material world in favor of the reality of ideas. Now, it's not as if he said that the real world doesn't exist. He did, but what he was really focused on was along the lines of something like Heraclitus, that reality is simply flux and constant change, and nothing Nothing is solid or unending. On the other hand, ideas can last forever. Ideas are timeless, ahistorical, eternal, again, within us, waiting to be discovered. And so if you deny the reality of the material world in favor of, or you prefer the world of ideas, again, that can make you somewhat dangerous, because depending on what that idea is, if it is never connected to any degree of reality or any grounding in the material world, that idea is something that you are going to begin to pursue. It's at your own peril. Because if the idea of, say, beauty or justice is one that you want to achieve at all costs, you are likely going to harm some people in trying to realize this idea here on earth. So to deny the reality of the material world can be somewhat dangerous, because if you are going to focus exclusively on ideas as being real, that's really all that's going to matter. What is right in front of you will not it won't register, because you're always trying to look behind. So Plato is very much that metaphysical animal that I've talked about now a number of times. He is perhaps one of the best, but also one of the worst, because he stakes everything on the reality and perfection of ideas, and that's at the cost of the material world. Number 9, the theory of forms or ideas refers to the belief that the material world is not the real world, but only an image or a copy of this real, perfect, ideal world. And again, these two ideas really tie together. And you can see, going back even to number 5, that Plato was not a fan of the demos, not a fan of the common people. He was very much disconnected with his world. He was more concerned with the reality of ideas rather than the reality of the material world. And so as a result, whatever he saw in front of him was always somehow inferior, always somehow less than. Because, of course, the material world comes into being, but then it ebbs away, it dies away, and all we're left with is an idea of it. And it's true. That's the way the material world is. But that's not to say that it is somehow less than or should be completely ignored for that ideal world. We can aim at ideals, but just like mythology, right? Mythology is not meant to be realized. It's meant to be aimed at. And we aim high. And even if we fall short, at least we're aiming high. Plato was ready to do anything to realize these ideas that should have really remained in a person's mind, rather than trying to create a world that follows exactly this notion of perfect forms, this notion of perfect justice or perfect beauty. So as much as Plato does present to us idealist thinking, he does also have some serious issues in terms of trying to make this connection between this ideal world, which is utterly distinct, ahistorical, timeless, and so on, with the reality in which he was living. Which leads us to our 10th point here in our top 10, that Plato's philosophical views had severe social and political implications, especially the existence of a city-state based on a perfect form of balance and symmetry. What Plato did in trying to stop the movement of history, and even at the time he's writing, the very notion of history doesn't really even exist. It took almost another 50 years before the first historian decided to catalog and to at least write down the world that they saw around them. So Plato's philosophical views really impacted tremendously his view of politics, his view of society. And remember, society as we know it today didn't really even exist, because there was on the one side the family / economics, because quite often the family became the source of your economic well-being, owning a farm or owning some sort of small factory, whatever it may be. The family generated the money upon which they lived, and then the other half was the state. And so Plato was very much concerned with the state. He's got all kinds of leisure time. He can sit and reflect and pontificate about the world to make it better. But yes, even though individuals had the chance to disagree with one another, Plato was still hell-bent on realizing these ideas here on earth. And as a result, the implications of trying to bring about perfection is always going to be fraught with problems because nothing is ever perfect. And some individuals, Whitehead, the British philosopher, says that really all Plato gave us in the end were isms. So fascism, communism, extremism of one sort or another, and the English school system. So there you are. That is what Plato gave us. And we need to think about exactly his ideas and how they relate to that real world. Ultimately, this is what matters. So let's start by taking a look at an early text called the Phaedrus. And Phaedrus is a book that he wrote along with a symposium. Both of these texts are fairly straightforward. They're fairly clear. I'm not saying easy to follow, but the ideas are well presented. And they deal with Plato's ideas of love. And I put in brackets of truth, but it is ideas of love. And we see here, and this is one of the things that is remarkable with Plato's work, is in these dialogues, we can see those critical tools at work. And we begin by Phaedrus telling us that love is an impulse full of beauty and goodness. It's a kind of divine madness. It opens us up to higher feelings, a movement to a higher realm. And there's that first step, right? We're metaphysical creatures, always trying to build bridges into that other world. And here's where it starts, right? Love is that impulse that is that momentary looking into perfection, beauty and goodness. And it drives us almost mad. But what it does is it opens us up to that otherness of existence, right? It lifts our soul. It enables us to start on that path towards capital T truth. So there's that first initial bridge, right? That moves us from the world of the here and now, of reality, of the material world, as we start taking that first small step into that beyond. So in Phaedrus, Plato shows us how something as simple as love can be that bridge that connects this world with the beyond. And it comes from falling in love with the beauty of the visible world. Now notice that he doesn't talk about the beauty of another person. He's talking about beauty and goodness in a general sense. And so we fall in love with the beauty of the visible world. And that statement should tell us that, again, Plato wasn't ready to completely denigrate the material world. He was using it as a stepladder, literally as a ladder to climb up to somewhere else. And so in Phaedrus, the notion of beauty is a really remarkable word that means so much to the Greeks who were using this term, because it didn't just mean, this picture is beautiful or this person's beautiful. It has such a wider and more comprehensive meaning. And this is why seeing beauty in the world was one of the ways in which we could open ourselves up, right, to that otherness that is beyond, right, that lies beyond. And really, at the end of the day, it isn't really beyond. It's within, right? It's within us, according to Plato. So for Plato, to fall truly in love starts that individual on the path upwards to where love is satisfied in the perfect beauty of truth. Now notice that love is satisfied not through sexual coupling, if we were talking about a couple, but to something higher, right? The notion of there's always something that lies beyond what we are experiencing in the here and now. So love is maybe temporarily satisfied through something like a sexual coupling, but it's that step to the next movement, right? The next realm. And that next realm, once we finally hit the very top, right, is this perfect notion of beauty, but also the perfect notion of the beauty of truth. And I mentioned a moment ago about a stepladder. Well, there you go, right? So if we look at Diotima's ladder, and this is, of course, I didn't say that facetiously. He actually does speak of almost like a kind of ladder. And here we can see how each of these steps, so let's say instead of a bridge, we're going to build ourselves a ladder, right? Step ladder as we move upwards. So we start at the bottom. The love of one beautiful person begets noble sentiments with them, and that's true. And then we realize beauty is similar in all persons, and we love all beautiful bodies and all beautiful individuals, and we love humanity. Now, that's not a bad idea. In fact, that's a fantastic idea, especially in this day and age. So we see our capabilities to love a single person, and that moves us to the next realm where we're talking about I can love all of humanity, not just one person. And then here, it's not only loving all of humanity physically, but loving the souls of each and every one of those people. So as we are moving towards that beyond, and we are moving up that ladder, everything gets more and more abstract. So we start with a single person, then we move to humanity in general, to the souls of each of those individuals. And again, the word soul is this very substantial and comprehensive term. And from there, we are in love with the beauty of the soul. So we're in love with something abstract. So it literally takes one step where we move from a single person to humanity in general, to the soul of humanity. And then we see beauty in activities, institutions, and sciences, all those things that those other individuals engage in, believe in, use. And so as we move up the ladder, we are moving into an increasingly abstract world. And the second last one, we gaze on what is called the ocean of beauty of the sciences. And we start to beget fine ideas. Now we're several rungs up the ladder here. We're not on solid ground anymore. We're moving into the world of abstract ideas. But certainly the ocean of beauty is a wonderful idea. But as we get to the very top, we see that beauty is revealed to us and we contemplate the form of beauty. And it could be then applied to literally anything. But this is what I mean when I say that with Plato, there are some interesting ideas, but depending on how you use that, right? In the case of beauty, perhaps less dangerous than the notion of justice, where harmony and balance might be forced upon people. Here in the Symposium, this is a much younger Plato. This is a Plato that is perhaps more willing to reconcile the reality of the material world with these abstract ideas that lie behind it. And that's one of the reasons why many students read the Symposium rather than the Republic, because it has to do with love, and there's some lovely ideas in there, no pun intended. But the notion that we move up this ladder into this realm of abstract ideas, it doesn't take much. It literally up the first rung. And now we're talking about humanity, then souls, then institutions, and in an ocean of beauty, we're swimming it. We're engulfed in it in this great beyond. And then finally, only at that point can we contemplate the form of beauty itself. So it is a remarkable book. And yet, Plato did not trust books. Why? Because they can't be questioned, because the person is not there to discuss them. The ideas are already closed off for correction or refinement or dissent. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when we were reading a passage from the Phaedrus, that books weaken the memory. The written language, not just books, but the written language in general, weakens the memory. And that notion is sort of designed around the idea that Plato thought we could experience all of the totality of the world in one lifetime. So our memories would be directly what we had experienced. We didn't read it in the book. We didn't look at some Polaroids that somebody had taken. We didn't talk to someone else who traveled elsewhere. The memories that we had experienced directly. We didn't read about them from secondhand information or secondhand sources, right? So books and language weaken the memory according to Plato. And yet he wrote constantly all through his life. And he did it by saying, okay, well, the written language weakens the memory. It leaves conversations closed. So why don't we write in a style where there is a dialogue that moves towards pure thoughts, discusses pure thoughts, and is only concerned with the search for knowledge. Really, when I first started philosophy, one of the most boring texts I could ever plow through were some of Plato's dialogues. They were dreadfully dry. I didn't get it. And then I realized much later what they were trying to do, right? They were trying to always focus on pure thoughts, and those pure thoughts had to be tested and had to be agreed to. And this truth by consensus was something I didn't understand the first time I read through them. This would be years and years ago. And so that search for knowledge that the characters in this dialogue, in this conversation, are engaged in, I wasn't picking up. And I didn't until much later. And I realized that this was what Plato was able to do to both be a writer and to try to maintain this notion of a lived experience. So the dialogues and the conversations are a kind of lived experience that are now written on papyrus or whatever they wrote on. And this was the way in which Plato could really kind of have it both ways. So regardless, the only truly valuable way to write, the only reason to write, is to inscribe and discuss and praise justice and beauty and good upon the soul of the person that is reading it. So how does he do all of this? He does it through this dialectical, sort of dialogic form where philosophical ideas are developed through discussions. They have real people and real settings, or at least we think that these people existed. Because remember, we don't know where Plato and Aristotle and these other individuals are buried. We can only assume that they lived at some point, and they lived and died in some area in Athens. Regardless here, to get back to what we're talking about, a dialogical form is the manner in which these philosophical ideas are unpacked, developed, and are tested, right? They're tested by having another person disagree or ask for clarification or dissent in some way. And of course, all of it is always moving towards something. It's moving towards the goal of consensus, right? Or truth through consensus. So that very elevated form of speech, because it is a very elevated form of the dialogue, which when you first read it sounds kind of dry and boring. But if you can understand why Plato writes the way he does, then it can be obviously a lot more interesting. So the elevation of speech into a literary form, right, was again the outcome of this fascination with language and with in particular with the written word. So that was the Phaedrus. Now the Republic is usually another book that individuals that start in the study of philosophy. It is a very important text. It's a text where ideas of truth and beauty and justice, again, really begin in earnest. And here we have Plato thinking about Pythagorean mysticism and tries to apply it to politics, or at least political ethics. And the only way to do that is to make it earthbound, right? Is to actually have it sit in the world somewhere. So this is the dilemma for Plato. How do I filthy up a perfect idea like justice and beauty by having it exist in the world? A world that I'm not particularly keen on because it's going to die away and it won't last forever. But at some point, you've got to start somewhere, right? You've got to start thinking about, well, what would a just society look like? And this is the main idea behind the Republic. So we have forms of truth, beauty, and justice that are discussed all through Plato's work. But we see it now for the first time elaborated in a lot of detail in the Republic. And primarily speaking, the Republic is about searching for a definition of justice. And justice here is not like going after someone who wronged you. The notion of justice is a notion of balance, notion of harmony. And balance and harmony come from the pre-Socratics that we talked about last week. That metaphor, that analogy of justice as harmony and balance comes from them. And Plato doesn't dismiss them. He borrows that metaphor and then applies it to a just society. What would that look like? And clearly, in the notion of justice, there's a notion of balancing forces. And ultimately, that's what the Republic is. It is a balancing of forces where there is the education of the soul, the education of the mind. There is sort of a detailed examination of poetry. There is a discussion of music, the role of women in this society, the role of religion, immortality, and all of these different aspects that are part of everyday Athenian life find their place, right? Find their place in this overall balance of the world. Now, the problem with, and here we start getting into the issues of trying to create something that is perfection itself, the Republic lays down this very absolute standard of human life, that people can only follow life or the standards of life along one particular line, as they are always trying to move towards what he called this universal light. So everything that is done, all the behaviors, all the belief systems, are always aiming towards that universal light. And so what are they looking for? What's being lit up, right? What's being lit up is that truth, right? The truth that lies beyond that shifting, changing world. And it's a truth, again, that only some people can see. The aristocrats, the well-off, the well-to-do, and the rest of the folks, well, you guys got a job to do. And therein lies the balance. This is what Plato calls balance. We have money and wealth and power and influence, and we have slaves that do our work so we can reflect. So we should be in charge of calling the shots. On the other half of the balance are the demos, the workers, the slaves, the migrants, the women. All those folks create a balanced world in the eyes of Plato. And he does that by saying, well, how else are we going to find this universal light? Some of us have got to do the thinking, but this is how he justifies setting up this world that is perhaps not fair, because if you are on the other end and you're not an aristocrat or landowner or well-to-do, well, there is a role for you in this society, but may not be a very good one. And please don't argue, because if you do, it's going to ruin the balance, right? It's going to ruin that geometric perfection. So the just state may not come into being because individuals are who they are, but we can see that what Plato is trying to do is to find a place for everybody, even if he doesn't like them that much. In Book 10, for example, he writes, I understand, he said, you mean the city whose establishment we have described, the city whose home is in the ideal, for I think that it can be found nowhere on earth. Well said. Perhaps there is a pattern of it laid up in heaven for he who wishes to contemplate it, and so beholding to constitute himself and its citizens. But it makes no difference whether it exists now or ever will come into being. The politics of this city only will be his and of none other. So here is an admission that it's likely not going to work. And this is what I mean when we talk about various isms, whether it's fascism, communism, totalitarianism, a push to the extreme, a forcing of otherwise known as historical development, a forcing of a change in a state of affairs, in a society, a political structure. That comes from Plato. And it says right here, there is a pattern of it laid up in heaven for he who wishes to contemplate it, and so beholding it, constitute himself its citizen. So if you can contemplate it, you can call the shots. There it is. There's Plato in Book 10 admitting that he's the one that's got the right idea, and we should follow through. Now, it's not necessarily a utopian blueprint. It's more of a kind of measuring stick, a kind of standard, right, by which good individuals should strive. And if that is the case, and if everybody does their job and they all aim towards the universal light, there is the likelihood, the possibility, because remember, this is only a text. This is not an actual policy planning text, but simply a blueprint that is going to give us some ideas as to what kind of political arrangement might result in the sort of world that Plato imagines. So, question still comes, or still ends up being, does it make an individual better than they were before? So, no polis, right, has ever been purely Platonic, because it would be extremely difficult for Plato or anyone else that tries to create some sort of perfect world, because ultimately that perfect world is a utopian world, and a utopian world is a world that doesn't exist. We have to accept life and the world with its problems, with its conundrums and contradictions and problems and issues. And this is why we pay some people lots of money to come up with policy planning, feasibility studies to correct a problem. So the question is still, does it make an individual better than they were before if they live in a slightly different society? Part of the reason why Plato was asking this question is because there is such a deep and abiding relationship between the Athenian citizens and the city-state. The city-state was the identifier for these individuals. The citizen of Athens would be willing to lay down their life because that's how much they cared about their city. So if you can make a city better, absolutely. What will it take? Can you make it perfect? Well, probably not, right? Because just like mythology, we aim high and we kind of get close to it, and we try again. But somehow Plato was convinced that we could create a republic by simply allowing him to create it the way he saw it in his mind, or this notion that he had intuited from within himself. Because at a Platonic ideal, the more you think about it, the more it moves into a kind of tyrannical political formation or some kind of extreme democracy. Very dangerous. Book 7, he writes, "But still, I said, for such purposes a slight modicum of geometry and calculation would suffice. What we must consider is whether the greater and more advanced part of it tends to facilitate the apprehension of the good. That tendency, we affirm, is to be found in all studies that force the soul to turn its vision round to the region where dwells the most blessed part of reality, which it is imperative that it should behold." Let's read through that last sentence again and look at the words. That tendency is to be found in all studies that force the soul. Now this is Rousseau, right? The general will force people to be free. So forces the soul to turn its vision round to the region where dwells the most blessed part of reality. And it is imperative that they see it. So you are going to force people to live a certain way. And there it is. There it is in that, well, blueprint, measuring stick, whatever you want to call it. But in the Republic are those kinds of statements. And Plato is not afraid to shy away from it. He's very proud of the fact that you can create this ideal state by simply telling people this is what we're going to do. On the one hand, we've got the vanguard state, we've got the guardian state that will, basically take care of us. They're a kind of police state and an army, and these are people that are born into this kind of role. And then on the other half, of course, the workers, and on the other half are the individuals that are lucky enough to reflect on beauty and perfection and justice because they don't have to work. And that's their job. They're just as busy doing that. So as you can tell, the Republic has its problems because it is rather monstrous, right? It's rather monstrous because the infinite types of behaviors and the infinite types of people that could constitute a society are now being shoehorned into this absolute science. And the fact that individuals are forced to fit into a particular way of life, and regardless of their desire to look towards the universal light or simply get on with their day, but Plato is saying, no, you have to. You have to do this. Everything has got to be under this absolute criteria of truth, of beauty, of justice, and the good. So, rather strange, rather unusual social formation, and certainly one that does not allow that society to grow sort of internally, to grow logically, to grow organically. This is not what Plato wants to do. He does not want to see a society grow organically from within. He is wishing to impose a structure upon that society that, of course, follows the criteria of truth, beauty, and justice, and so on, but at what cost, right? The problem here is this political philosophy is being guided by geometry, as he says in line 526. Well, why is that, right? Why is it that geometry was the perfect political solution? Let's take a look. So for Plato, the essence of geometry can only be grasped by the intellectual, also by the intellect, but primarily the intellectual. And he says in Book 7, right, it compels the soul to contemplate essence, not what the thing is, but what is its essence? What is its true being? What is its best version of itself? So there's the first thing. Geometry is something we use, but it's not a tangible thing. It's only something that can be grasped by the intellect. So there's the first thing. Secondly, the notion of geometry as pure knowledge. Again, remember, disconnected from reality. These are just ideas. So the objects of geometry are pure and absolute. As he says in 527, for all their talk is of squaring and applying and adding and the like, whereas in fact, the real object of the entire study of geometry is simply pure knowledge. Pure knowledge, disconnected from reality, disconnected from the material world. utterly unlike what we know and see. So we have geometry grasped by the intellect. The object of geometry is pure knowledge. And 3, geometry is ahistorical. In 527 also, it is the knowledge of that which always is. There's that intuitive knowledge, right? Always waiting to be discovered because it's always already been there. So it is the knowledge of that which always is, and not of something which at some time comes into being and passes away. So rather than looking to the material world, as a policy planner would, instead, Plato uses geometry because its object is knowledge, or pure knowledge. It's grasped by the intellect, and it's ahistorical. This is the appeal of geometry for Plato as it applies to this notion of the Republic. So when Plato is writing about democracy, it is a very false image of democracy. It is a world in which people have very little choice in what they can do, where they can live, what sort of job they wish to go after, because all Plato is concerned with is creating a balance. We only need 12 fishermen, and we need 10 shoemakers, and we need half a dozen cabinet makers, and we need people to work the salt mines, don't forget. So it is a set number. So is that true democracy? No, it isn't. It's a kind of totalitarianism. And the fact that there is a totalizing impulse to create a world along a certain idea, a certain singular idea of justice. Sounds great, but the reality can be quite awful and quite scary. So Plato's construction of democracy is false, and this has had a lot of serious historical consequences. Now, this is not to say that Plato tried to rewrite the same book. What's remarkable about his work is he kept going back to the same idea and trying to reformulate it. And as he got older and perhaps less cranky, he seemed to come up with slightly more doable and relevant versions. In the Statesman, for example, he advances the idea that there can be epistemes, right, or knowledge of politics. In other words, individuals can have an understanding of politics that might make them better politicians, or at least better individuals to help to control the state. Knowledge that could be gained through interacting in the political domain. Now you can imagine, right, if you're interacting in the political domain and you're looking for those epistemes of politics, you're not working the salt mines, are you? Right? You are busy being a politician. You're not getting your hands dirty. That's someone else's job. So Plato completely overturns this Greek idea of justice as a question that remained completely open to the city. Okay, who was to give what to whom, and who was to have what? How would things be balanced? How would things be distributed? Whether it's wealth, whether it's property, whether it's goods and services, whether it's families even. For example, in this usually strikes students as an extreme version. The notion of the family is even gone in the Republic, and instead, children are raised in communities. So when he asked the question, who was to give what to whom, and who was to have what, even the family is taken apart in Plato's Republic. And what was normally the economic foundation of society is now spread across a whole range of different fields of goods and services. But so is child rearing, which is, to say the least, a radical idea, that he was ready to dissolve the family in creating this image of democracy. This is typically one when I point out to students, they don't catch it at first. And I say, well, read what he's saying. He's looking to abolish the family to create a more ideal condition where everyone shares literally everything else. So there's a communal notion of property that is holistic, but it is a communal notion of human property as well. That's the really remarkable part. So what do we have here in the end, right? In the Republic, we have a kind of justice as balance with the idea of the city as a whole, right? As a totality, can be divided and articulated so that within that totality are a whole range of little subcategories and subdivisions that are functioning and working with one another, all towards the same thing, towards this notion of justice. He writes in Book 9, each man must perform one social service in the state for which his nature has been adapted. Not that let's read that again. Each man must perform one social service in the state for which his nature has been adapted. When we think of nature, that's something we innately do. I innately, apparently, love to cook, and I really love baking. It's fun, but I didn't know that. 10 years ago, you could have asked me that, or 20 years ago, asked me if I was, if I enjoyed renovating. I would have said, I have no idea. So my nature is such that I think I know I'm good at certain things, but Plato's not concerned with that. We're saying with which his nature has been adapted. You will be adapted. In other words, you will be shoehorned into this job. And again, he goes on, and again, that to do one's own business and not be a busybody in justice is a saying that we have heard from many. In other words, quit your bitching. Quit your bitching and get on with your job, says Plato. So an interesting view of social life, a very interesting view of the family, and an even more interesting view of human nature. Okay, so we're moving now from the Republic, and we're shifting slightly. And again, hopefully this notion of this idealist world that he's describing, you can see that it's got some serious problems here. So one of the things with Plato is that he was living in a society that allowed for dissent and allowed for argument and disagreement. And Plato was literally crapping all over the city-state that allowed him to do that, and would look at Athens as somehow inferior to other city-states like, say, Sparta. Well, guess what? Sparta would have welcomed him for about 30 seconds, found that he was utterly useless and he couldn't do anything, and would have kicked him out. And why am I saying that? Because the very reason why Plato was able to say these kinds of things was because the society in which he lived was at least democratic, was allowing people to dissent. And here he is whining about the condition that he's in and looking to other city-states as being better, and not realizing that the world that he thinks is better wouldn't allow him to live the way he had at all. So something very strange is going on, because Plato is very cool, right? Very indifferent to Athens. He talks of its democratic structure as being horrible. He has a kind of imperialistic racial pride in his own kind of political will. Really unusual for someone who, on the one hand, says that, democracy is awful and openness and open society is awful, and yet takes full advantage of it to tell us how awful it is. Rather paradox. Now, compared to Socrates, who, as far as we know, was a true citizen, who fought in wars, his sons fought in wars, he was an active member of that society, an active member of the city-state. Plato wasn't. He formed his academy. He never had any degrees in biology, physics. He wasn't even a scientist. He was just a writer, but created an academy and basically lived in it. So when you hear about the term a professor in the ivory tower, think of Plato. He owned the first ivory tower. Now, to move to the next book in Laws, this is a rather telling statement here. Quote, "If and when we have seen our men scrupulously selected, duly educated, settle at the end of the process in the nation's central fortress, and established there as guardians, whose likes we have never seen in our whole lives, for perfection as protectors." So again, we have individuals whose sole job it is to protect perfection. How that's done, we don't know. But certainly, what if someone comes along and, has an argument about what this perfection is? What happens to them? Are they silenced? In a democracy, they wouldn't be. They would be listened to, because didn't Plato finally say, hey, truth by consensus? And here he is in his own books saying, well, no, there's no room for disagreement, right? You have to follow the rules. Don't butt into other people's lives. Don't be a busybody. We need people to protect this perfection. A very unusual place. Okay, so let's give Plato a little bit of breathing room here as we move on to the next one, the Statesman, which is slightly less unyielding, slightly less dangerous, because we can't really call Plato a totalitarian, although very close. But if we think about what he's doing, and it's this, right? He's trying to halt or manipulate the evolution of history, the organic inner movement of history, because there is movement in history and then there's the movement of history. Plato ignores both. And that's what an idealist does. They don't worry about what's happening in the world. They don't look for currents, trends. Where were we? Where are we going? Where are we at? Irrelevant. Because for them, for Plato, everything is timeless. Everything is ahistorical. Everything has always existed. We just need to bring it into being. So he may not be a totalitarian, but he is certainly trying to halt and manipulate the evolution of history that, as a result, has made him an inspiration for others who try to do the same thing. And I am guilty of saying both sides, both Marxism and fascism. Any form of totalitarianism is a kind of Platonic view of the world. So any kind of ism that moves to the extreme of forcing a change in history, and in other words, rather than having evolution, they have revolution. That revolution is a kind of Platonic idea. And so when we have individuals that think this way, we need to be very, very careful, because Plato views nearly everyone else as merchants in falsehoods, contradictions, traders in fallacies. And of course, he was especially hateful of the sophists, because he believed that these guys could make a living off lying. In fact, they were living a lie. And yet here's Plato availing himself of all the rhetorical devices that a sophist would use. So on the one hand, he is slamming the sophists for manipulating an argument, and then turns around and says, well, really, that's a terrible thing, but only I should be allowed to do this. So again, a paradoxical character, interesting ideas, and yet when we apply them, there are some serious problems. Because when we talk about Plato's attack on the sophists, the very things that the sophists do are the exact same things that Plato does in his own writings. Because he is the final arbiter, the final author of those statements. It isn't it isn't Socrates, it isn't Phaedrus, it isn't Parmenides or anyone else. It's Plato. And he constructs the argument in such a way that the truth that he's aiming at is the one he believes in. But anyone else that is going to cause any sort of dissent, he considers as merchants of falsehood. You know who that is? He was around a short time ago. Used to talk about fake news all the time. Same kind of guy. Okay, so the statesman is a slightly less drastic view of politics. And what he does talk about, too, are these necessary principles that the world needs to come into being. And this, at least, is fairly interesting because it has to do with just sort of living in life and the world as we see it. And this is, again, one of the first times when Plato's very strident position as an idealist begins to sort of soften a little bit. And so he talks about these four things. He talks about eternal being. Now, does that sound familiar? Eternal being? Parmenides, isn't it? The eternal being that Parmenides is talking about, the paradigm in which the world is created, that's what he borrows from the pre-Socratics. Now, this next one you should also see is familiar. Eternal becoming. Heraclitus. So, in The Statesman, Plato is trying to reconcile these two radically different views of the world, eternal being, or what Parmenides had talked about, and eternal becoming, or what Heraclitus had talked about, which at every moment is always other. It's always the two opposites that are held in place as they're shifting back and forth in this struggle between strife and love and so on. So being and becoming are two different things. Something is, and then it becomes something else. And then he adds to that subordinate deities, or what he called daemons. And these daemons are these individuals, not actual individuals, but they're kind of angels. Angels that live between the realm of the gods and goddesses and us. And the daemons are the sort of intermediaries, the connectors between us here in the world and gods that we can communicate with. And the daemons fashion that sensible world from eternal ideas. So what happens, and again, bear with me here, Plato believes that we as mere human beings, mortal beings that wear down and, die and so on, we can communicate with the gods, and the gods show us where these ideas are through the daemons. So the daemons are the conduits, the intermediaries, whatever you want to call them, and they are the vessel, the vehicle, the bridge, whatever, into that other world to get those ideas and bring them back. And if we can believe in that, along with eternal being and becoming, what we end up with is a kind of balance between creation, which is becoming, and destruction, and between a beginning and an end. And this balance between being, isness, we'll say that something is, and becoming, it was this, now shall be that. There has to be a balance between these forces, the forces of being at a certain moment and becoming something else. And that shift from one to the other is brought about by the daemons, right? Who are those conduits between us and those intuited ideas that are in the realm of the gods and goddesses. Yeah, it's pretty trippy, and it really is. But Plato presents it to us as a kind of ananke, and ananke is Greek for necessity. So this balance is necessary for the world to be. We need these forces in a sense of balance, right? In a sense of just. So this is where the statesman is presenting some really radical ideas, but always trying to present it in a way that will make sense in the here and now. So we have to ask ourselves, right? If the daemon do exist, and they are those conduits towards perfection and beauty and truth, capital T, capital B, and all the rest of it, if a subordinate deity of absolute goodness has created the world, why is there evil, right? Why is there evil? If the daemons are only going to give us good things, why does evil exist in the world? Well, there's either no evil, evil is an illusion, or, unlike the Christian God, Plato's daemons have not created the raw material and are therefore not responsible. And there's Plato again, trying to have it both ways, right? Trying to have his cake and eat it too. So what he's saying is, well, the daemons aren't the ones who actually created evil. Maybe they didn't explain goodness well enough and we misunderstood. So how often would that happen, right? It's a cop-out is what it is. And so here's the question of evil. It either is an illusion and it doesn't exist, or maybe it's the absence of good, or that the daemons are not responsible. And if the daemons are not responsible, certainly the gods and goddesses aren't either, because the daemons are their conduits, their messengers, right? And so the daemons didn't create evil, we did. All right, so that's his argument. Aristotle responds when he says that Plato's arguments don't hold up. Big surprise there, because they're incomprehensible, right? Why would a deity that is perfection itself produce anything less than perfection? So there we are. It's a completely valid response. This kind of corner that Plato has painted himself into is one where he has great difficulty trying to get back out of it. He says, okay, well, it's either an illusion, thinking like Parmenides, right? Change is just an illusion. Apparently, so is evil. Or it's not their fault, right? It's our fault. We misunderstood. And Aristotle says, no. A deity, if it is perfection, if we're going to use Plato's ideas, if it is perfection, then their ideas should themselves be perfection. And so Aristotle imagines a God that is entirely separate from this material world. And again, this is something that the Christians pick up on, because we have different versions of gods. We have deism and theism. And for Aristotle, what he's presenting to us is a possibility of a deist God, a God that is utterly separate from the material world, utterly distinct, no relationship to it whatsoever. So something to think about. So we have been looking at a lot of stuff, a lot of material about Plato, and we're slamming them every which way because there are some serious problems. I still need to teach you the lesson though, but I want you to at least consider these things. But certainly with Plato, there are 4 distinct periods in his writing. The writings of his youth, which would be the Apology, the Crato, Lysis, the Two Hippas, and Ion. There are those. Then we have the attacks on sophism, Protagoras, Maximinus, Georgius, the first part of the Republic. So we have attacks on specific people. Then we start having really kind of the main focus of what Plato is known for, which is his theory of ideas. So the Meno, the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, Symposium, and Republic, those are the main texts that typically individuals read when they want to know about Plato and his sense of idealism. So we talked a little bit about Phaedrus, we talked about Symposium, the Republic, and then finally we're going to look at the work of his mature period, which is, when we say mature, like he's in his 70s and 80s at this point. The Sophist, the Statesman, the Timaeus, the Critias, Philebus, the Laws, all of these books are from different periods. Now, the Statesman is not one that individuals typically read in terms of the totality of Plato's work, but I think it is really important because it is a very different view of politics that we have up to this point been presenting. So why should we study the Statesman and talk about it? Well, first of all, it belongs to Plato's fourth and last period. And this is kind of a culmination of a lifetime of thinking about politics. It's a manifestation of where the change in definition becomes something that is more useful. The notion of someone who can govern, a statesman or a politician, or in the case of the image here, the metaphor is of a weaver. So we have in the beginning the Republic, we have a philosopher king. In the Laws, which comes the very last book, we have a magistrate. And in the Statesman, we have the notion of a weaver, right? This is a really interesting metaphor because a weaver is someone that weaves together something brand new and takes strands from other places in order to create something brand new. And of course, what they're weaving is a society, right? A political entity, a state. So he writes in line 305 of the Statesman, there is an art which controls all these arts of rhetoric, of war, and of kingly rule. It is concerned with the laws, with all that belongs to the life of the community. It weaves all into its unified fabric with perfect skill. It is a universal art, and so we call it by name of universal scope. That name is one which I believe to belong to this art, and to this alone, the name of statesmanship. So the notion of a weaver is really the notion of a statesman that is able to bring together all those necessary aspects of life so that individuals can live within that society in some degree of peace and harmony, right? The same ideas are there, justice and harmony, but there's something perhaps a little bit less terrifying about statesman versus the Republic, because here we have a definition of a statesman that is clear, the notion of a weaver rather than a philosopher king, weave together the arts that are necessary for human life in that city. And of course, as they're doing it, they're also weaving together the different components of virtue and justice. So Plato hasn't lost sight of the big, his prize, right? The big picture, which is virtue, balance, and justice. But the statesman, at this late part of his life, becomes the metaphor that he wishes to present to others who are reading his work. He says, look, the statesman is who he knows. He knows what each is to do because he possesses true knowledge. Again, it isn't some hack, but they have the epistems of political knowledge, but they possess true knowledge. Now, what is that? That is to follow what is the just thing to do. So again, Plato doesn't lose sight of that original idea, which is to create a fair, just, and balanced society. And only certain people can possess that true knowledge, which is to follow what is just, what is the right thing to do. Now, it isn't even just the just thing to do. The right thing, the just thing. Now, in that, there is the possibility that there could be some difficulties, but the just thing to do should, in theory, benefit the most number of people. That's almost a kind of utilitarian way of thinking about the world, the notion of the greater good. So the statesman, as the weaver, weaves together these various components that are necessary for the life of the city, but also necessary for that higher ideal of virtue and justice. And as a utilitarian, believes that certain actions will lead to a greater good. And if the greater good is a reflection of virtue and justice, then obviously it's the right thing to do. Now, for Plato, governance is a kind of art, right? The demos are not able to grasp this particular art because it is based on intelligence and knowledge. And as a result, only a city governed by a political or royal individual is possible. So there is only a very small number of people who can be in charge. And that is something that is run through all of Plato's work. And sure enough, in the Statesman, line 297, you remember that we said that in no community whatsoever could it happen that many people received this gift of political wisdom and the power to govern by pure intelligence which would accompany it. So no community where it could happen where many people have it, only a few, only in the hands of the select few or the enlightened individual can we look for that right exercise of political power, which is itself the one true constitution. So again, it's not available to the demos. Plato's not a fan, never has been a fan. We have to be able to intuit that true knowledge. And again, this is only for certain people because for you to sit and reflect, you have to have spare time. And you can only have spare time if someone else is doing the work. And the same theme is running through this one. But for some reason, a weaver as a metaphor is somehow easier to swallow than it is a philosopher king. So the Statesman is that transitional moment where Plato is talking about a philosophical theory that is going to be a kind of blueprint or at least a measuring stick for a perfect city-state that's been too far removed, right? With the Republic, we have an idea which is almost not incomprehensible, but utterly unlike anything we've ever seen before. It is so radically different from the world that out of which it was created that we really are not sure where to start. Because again, rather than letting history organically move along, at its pace, here we have someone trying to force a structure onto it. But the Statesman sits between these two periods. When Plato was writing philosophical theory that would create a state, but that was too far removed from reality, and this period where he's focusing more and more on the power of the idea. Could the idea be an influencer? Could it be a goal to aim at rather than we must realize this idea of justice no matter what, right? He's starting to soften at this point. He's in his 70s, right? He's getting old. Now, the structure of the statement is one long dialogue, and there's all kinds of digressions, corrections, clarifications. If there's any text that is as close to a conversation as you could imagine, it's this one. So the dialogue allows speakers to go back and forth and correct an error, that they had made previously or a false thought. So it is very much similar to just a conversation. People go back and correct themselves. Now, the final text is the laws, and Plato, again, all of his life, he was trying to create this just society. So this is why I wanted to look at these ideas, because it gives us a chance to look at the totality of Plato's work by just looking at one idea, right? How is the idea of, should use a different term. How does idealism manifest itself in political theory? And it does it through these 4 books that we've looked at so far. So Plato, regardless, no matter how old he was and how cranky he was becoming, or less so, was still tormented by this idea to create this just society. And at the age of 80, right, he was still looking. So at the age of 80, he writes the Laws. And the Laws is really just a long, massive code book. Not so much about conversations and dialogues. It's really kind of a code book. It is if there is a kind of metaphor, it would be like a kind of blueprint, or, a rule book of one sort. And every possible detail of social life is covered. The role of citizens, the role of foreigners, the role of slaves. All these individuals are all dealt with because they all comprise the totality of that society. So Plato isn't just talking about certain individuals. He finally realizes that, he may go away, but the idea of politics will reside forever. So he finally sort of faces the truth and realizes that, yes, a society or a city-state has many different people that live in it, and each one of them has to be addressed directly in order to find out where they fit. So the whole system is conceived on behalf of creating a just state for all of its members. Now, there's a big difference between the Laws and other texts. Socrates, by this point, is long gone. There is no one person that, well, hey, what about this? What about that? there is discussion, but not in the form of a dialogue as we saw prior, where there is a tremendous amount of dissent and digression and correcting and recorrecting. It's a dialogue simply about good and bad laws, right? And so it's almost as if the two individuals that are speaking, or the three in this case, that are speaking, already have a pretty good idea of what a good or bad law is and are trying to clarify to the others what they mean. So what types of laws should be in a good constitution, that's certainly very helpful and useful. And those three main characters realize that this will not be an ideal state. And this is a lowercase I, not ideal as we've been talking about with a capital I, but a lowercase I. It will not be a perfect state or an ideal state because we want to make sure that there are laws that we have that will be the best that we can come up with. Because this is what was remarkable about Athens at the time. These were not laws coming from on high, not coming down from the gods, but were in fact ideas that were being generated from within that community, right? Within that democratic entity called Athens. So the three main characters agree that this will not be ideal, but there should be laws of one sort or another. There may be some laws that will be unjust. We need to learn what they are and discuss them. But the rule of law is the second best. It's the best way to go about it. Just laws would be ideal, but we may not be able to achieve those, but we can at least try. So laws, the rule of law is an expression of the true opinion of the social community, and if properly carried out, will lead to an increasing understanding of the ideal, right? By which the actual laws can be improved. So there's a kind of conciliatory feeling in Plato's work here, in this last one that he writes in his 80s, right? He's 80 years old. And it's this, the notion that there is a rule of law. So a republic, ironically, that's what the name of the first book was, but a republic, even to today, whether it's France or whether it's the United States, that is a republic, or those are republics. And those are republics in which the political system is based on the rule of law. It comes from Plato, and it comes from this book, Laws. So when I talked a couple of weeks ago about the influence of Greek thought on 18th century France and 19th century Germany, it comes from this. So the rule of law is an expression of what the social community believes to be good and true and just. And if it's properly carried out, it will be ideal. And we can at least aim at what our understanding is of ideal justice, ideal truth. And so if we can use that as a kind of guideline, let's not aim for it slavishly and dangerously. Let's aim for it and say, in the perfect world, that ideal law would look like this. Can we approximate it in the real world? And so that's why he says, if we have an increased understanding of the ideal, then we can take those actual laws and improve them. And that is really where Plato finally ends, right? He's old, he's tired, the world is no longer what it was before. In fact, the city-state has now been at war for many years. It's depleted its resources. The notion of the adherence of the citizen to the city-state is now starting to crumble a little bit, because what's happening is mercenaries are coming into fight on behalf of Athens. And they're there just for the money. They're not there for the glory of Athens. They're there to get paid, right? To get paid and kill people. And so Plato is really having a tough time saying, well, the Athens is this pure entity and we believe in it, we support it, when there are people who are getting paid to kill on behalf of Athens. So this really kind of undercuts and muddies the kind of relationship that Plato thought was ideal, because it wasn't. So by this point, there's no time for poetical thoughts and storytelling. The beyond is really kind of fading, and there is a kind of disillusion in Plato's work. But what is remarkable is for Plato to be deluded makes him a better human being, because now he can come down to earth and realize that some of the things that he talked about have occurred. So if there was ever a point in history of philosophy where someone became disillusioned for a good reason, it was Plato, because he was so enamored by the idea, the capital I idea, that it distorted his view of the world. And only in old age did he realize that, well, if we can find laws that are close to an ideal and we can improve them, that's not bad. But it took this long. He started writing in his 20s. So for 60 years, he struggled with this. And finally, in his disillusionment, he creates a text which ends up being a text that was relevant. And the notion of the rule of law as the political basis for a community or a political structure was a remarkable one. And that's essentially Plato. That's kind of really what he was trying to say, that saying that, the chief business of the state is to mold character, moral characters, rather than, moving knowledge forward, which is remarkable. This is not something that Plato would have said prior when he was younger. And really all he's trying to say is, look, justice must be there. It must be that influencer. It must be the motivator for laws. But we cannot have the kind of justice that exists in its pure form. And it takes him 60 years to realize that, yeah, this is how it's going to work. And in the Republic, he talked about human affairs, as almost kind of irrelevant. And he goes back to the same ideas in the laws, but he says, look, it's still necessary to take them seriously because otherwise we're not going to have a society whatsoever. So to summarize, we have in the Georges, Socrates says that the true statesman is the philosopher. He says in the Georges, I think that I am one of the very few Athenians, not to say the only one, engaged in the true political art. There's this idea, the art of politics, and that of the men of today, I alone practice statesmanship. I aim at what is best, not as what is most pleasant. So there's a utilitarian way of thinking, right? Aim for the good at what is best, but it may not always be the same thing. There we go to the Republic and the philosopher king in Book 5. Unless, said I, either philosophers become kings, the king of our states, or those whom we now call kings and rulers take to the pursuit of philosophy seriously and adequately, and there is a conjunction of these two things, political power and philosophical intelligence, while the motley hordes of the natures who at presently pursue either apart from the other are compulsorily excluded. Wow. Okay. So we either have a philosopher who becomes a king, or a king who learns philosophy for real. And if we don't, then the motley hordes are going to be taking over. There he is. These are politicians. And Plato considers them to be motley hordes who at present pursue neither political power nor intelligence. Pretty nasty. And then finally, the statesman, the second last one, gives us a definition of the royal man, the royal individual. Maybe vague, but we still have this idea of the royal weaver, right? And he writes in the Statesman, only in the hands of the select few or the enlightened individual can we look for the right exercise of political power, which is itself the one true constitution. For we must call all other constitutions mere imitations of this. Some are more perfect copies of it. Others are grosser and less adequate limitations. So we must always move towards that true constitution that really is informed and supported by justice and harmony. And then finally, in the laws, where the government is almost democratic, it's aristocratic, but hey, better than a totalitarian government. It's aristocratic in Aristotle's sense, since these magistrates are elected, not drawn by lots. Now, to be drawn by lots simply means the lots are put in this little machine that sort of falls from top to bottom. It's gravity fed, and it's just literally luck. But magistrates here are elected, right? You have to prove to people that you can do what you claim that you can do. So in the laws, he says, the readiest starting point would be autocracy. The next best, constitutional monarchy. The next best again, democracy of a kind. Oligarchy would come forth, and only admits of such a development with great difficulty, for the number of persons of influence is greatest. So an autocracy for Plato was ideal. Next, a constitutional monarchy, which is a king with a constitution, and then somehow a democracy of a kind, and an oligarchy, which is kind of what the U.S. is like right now. Very, very rich and influential and powerful people run a country. That's an oligarchy. That's the U.S. And finally, sorry, it's not a democracy anymore. It is an oligarchy. And Plato thinks that that's perfectly fine. Now, why would he say that? Because he's an aristocrat, because he's well off, because he has power and prestige. And that's why he says, yeah, that's what we need. So there we are. That is Plato, warts and all four of his main political texts, as we look at the idea of idealism and justice and truth and beauty, and how difficult it is to bring it down to the here and now into a social formation. So that's it for Plato from Module 4, and we'll be back next week for Module 5 and Aristotle and materialism. Take care, and we'll see you soon.